Psychoanalysis, four fundamentals: fear, death, pain, loss, attack. These are the fears which are the most fundamental. Namaste. Anxiety is an inseparable companion of psychoanalysis. Can all forms of anxiety be reduced to a few categories? If yes, how does the constellation work? We discuss the concept of a fundamental typology of anxiety with psychoanalysis consultant Mr. Himanshu Vaidya. Namaste, sir.
Namaste.
So, is there a way of grouping numerous instances of anxiety into a few fundamental groups?
Yes, there is a way of doing it. Everyone in therapy knows that anxiety can manifest itself in a variety of ways. If you look at psychoanalysis, anxiety is one of the most common companions of most pathological manifestations. So, when we look at anxiety and the numerous forms and manifestations of anxiety, a natural question arises: can we group them in a few finite categories? And this can be done based upon a variety of criteria. It can be based upon the type of objects which are soliciting anxiety, or it can be based upon the nature of desire which is leading to that anxiety. Some of the ways of categorizing anxiety we can go into. Let us say one way to look at it is to look at anxiety in connection to desire. A very generic way of conceptualizing this is to say that at the root is desire, and desire can lead to satisfaction of desire or dissatisfaction of desire. Satisfaction of desire is pleasure, dissatisfaction of desire is pain. And therefore, given the state of the world, there is no guarantee that desire will be satisfied. So the moment there is desire and there is uncertainty about its satisfaction, right, anxiety arises. So one way to look at anxiety is to look at it in relation to desire, that non-satisfaction of desire or anticipated non-satisfaction of desire can lead to pain, anxiety, anger. Today we'll focus only on anxiety, not on anger and pain, but essentially all the three are involved. That non-satisfaction of desire or anticipated non-satisfaction of desire will give rise in different proportions to all the three: anger, sadness, and pain. Anger, sadness, and anxiety. Okay. So today we focus only on anxiety. Now, one way to look at desire is to classify desire into four categories: desire of sense pleasure, desire of ego pleasure, desire of emotional pleasure, and desire of creative pleasure. And correspondingly, there will be an anxiety associated to all the four categories. There is an anxiety related to sense pleasures, there is an anxiety related to ego pleasure, anxiety related to emotional pleasure, and anxiety related to creative pleasure. So that is one way of conceptualizing anxiety into four categories. Freud conceptualized it in two categories: the generic anxiety or the catastrophic anxiety or the anticipatory anxiety, and the signal anxiety. So there was an anxiety which was related to anticipation of non-satisfaction of desire or anticipation of something traumatic, versus a signal desire, a signal anxiety, which was like a postman running ahead of the message, which is telling you that difficult emotions are coming up. So he conceptualized anxiety into two ways, the anticipatory and the signal. The anticipatory is what usually we call catastrophic. So either you call it anticipatory and signal or catastrophic and signal. Third way of looking at anxiety is to classify desire into 7 components. That the desire is for pleasure of the desire is for sense pleasures, the ego pleasure, the emotional pleasure, the intellectual pleasure, the artistic pleasure, the mystical pleasure, and the spiritual pleasure. And corresponding to each of these 7 categories, there would be anxiety related to its non-satisfaction. And this would create a typology where anxiety gets classified into 7 categories. Now, one more way of looking at anxiety is to look at anxiety essentially into 2 categories, anxiety of death and anxiety of pain. And this is something very generic. Surprising part is, this is something which even a layman can figure out. And the surprising part is, it is not at the center of psychoanalysis or psychology.
Right.
And the reasons I think are 3 why it is so. One, as Heidegger used to say, it is too near to be found. It is so obvious, so generic that we just walk past it. It seems too simple to be really profound. It seems too obvious to really be the fundamental answer to anything. Second part is, it is very difficult to deal with them at a generic level. That once you find out that there is fear of death and fear of pain, what are you going to do about it? It's not easy to bring it up in therapy and then enable the patient to do something about it. And the third part is, this is an area where psychoanalysis touches spirituality. And maybe the way to come out after touching these 2 fundamental fears can be more spiritual in nature than psychoanalytic in nature. So these 3 actually prevent us from recognizing something very basic and very obvious and very profound, that there are 2 fundamental fears, the fear of death and the fear of pain. And then we come to the question of loss and attack. Right? That if you look at fundamental fears at an operational level, at a macro level in therapy, most people, when they talk about their life, we can make out 2 fears, the fear of loss and fear of attack, almost being universal. It's not a question of patient, it's a question of every human being. The fear of loss and the fear of attack, the fear of death and the fear of pain, these are universal human characteristics. You don't have to be a patient to have these characteristics. But in therapy, coming back to it, we inevitably find people in therapy, especially in psychoanalytic psychotherapy, that people have anxiety related to loss and anxiety related to attack. And this get reported directly or indirectly. Most of the times indirectly. People narrate incidents, events of their life, and we are able to very clearly figure out there is anxiety of loss or anxiety of attack. And in personality disorders, though it is completely pervasive, that the fear of loss and fear of attack is conspicuously at play. Right? No matter how hard you try, you can't miss it. You can't even escape it. So these four fears, the fear of loss, the fear of attack at a reported macro level, and at a deeper level, the fear of loss and fear of attack can be reduced to fear of death and fear of pain. We'll see how it can be done later. And therefore, these four fears appear to us too very easy to find out in therapy. Two, we have to bring in by inference and analysis into discussion. But these four fears, fear of loss, fear of attack, fear of death, fear of pain, seem to be four fundamental fears at work in the human psyche, pathological or otherwise. One part. One more addition before I stop for the question. There is something which is also called annihilation anxiety. And this is a shade different than death anxiety. Let us say somebody believes in reincarnation. He would have a death anxiety, but he would probably not have annihilation anxiety because it's going to be again. But suppose somebody does not believe in reincarnation, right? He can have annihilation anxiety, that I will just be annihilated and never have any existence again. And somebody can also say that not only I will die and not have any existence again, but all that I have done in this world will be erased completely. And the complete erasure would lead to annihilation. And there would be anxiety against that complete erasure from the world. That not only you cease to exist, but everything related to you, your memories in the minds of people, the work that you have done, all that you have left behind, everything is erased. And that leads to a real annihilation. And there is an annihilation anxiety, slightly different from death anxiety. And this is where I would say in certain situations, annihilation anxiety different than death anxiety also comes up. But in most situations, we look at the four fears, the four fundamental fears, the fear of death, the fear of pain at a generic level, and fear of loss and fear of attack at the operational therapy level. So this is how we can introduce the first few ideas related to the four fundamental anxieties that we have.
So despite everybody being hardwired to some extent to these basic four fundamental fears, the magnitude can be a decision making to the intensity what a person is going through to check on to the pathology. And when we see the other 7 and 4 desire-based ones, which of the above typology actually works best in the therapy context?
In the therapy context, the typology of the fear of death and the fear of pain, that works very well.
Oh, I thought the annihilation because of the Freudian basis would be the best.
No. The annihilation anxiety comes up in certain cases where we have to go to annihilation anxiety. And this involves very early life object loss. And this also brings in the element of the duality of reverie and torture.
Oh.
Right. So this is one particular situation, but in general, for a majority of cases, the category of looking at anxiety in terms of two fundamental anxieties, the anxiety of death and the anxiety of pain, as two generic forms of anxiety, and other forms of anxiety arising out of them. So this works very well in case of therapy. And then the question comes up as to how these two generic anxieties relate to the two operational anxieties of loss and attack.
Right.
And there we see that the fear, anxiety of attack essentially is anxiety of pain.
Yeah.
In some cases, anxiety of attack can also be anxiety of survival if the attack is actually so threatening and brutal. Okay? So the anxiety of attack can be reduced to a more generic form of anxiety of pain in most cases, and in some cases, anxiety of death and anxiety of pain combined.
Survival too.
Survival, right? So this is how anxiety of attack can be reduced to anxiety of pain, anxiety of death and anxiety of pain. Now coming to the anxiety of loss. When we talk of anxiety of loss, there are elements involved, like one, the pain of separation, because loss involves separation, the pain of loss. So the pain of loss. So even when you talk of anxiety of loss, it is anxiety of the pain involved in loss. And one thing which is difficult to accept for most of us is that the breaking of attachment and the loss and the separation or even rejection is related at a deeper unconscious level to abandonment, and abandonment is related to death. The deeper dynamic is that if I am abandoned, I will die. And abandon can be individual or social. And that is why shame is so important. That shame is something which can lead to social abandonment. And social abandonment is also related to the fear of death. That if I am abandoned by the whole herd, and we are a herd species, if I am abandoned by the herd, my chances of survival go down. And this is how it used to be in the jungle. That if I am abandoned by the herd, my chances of survival go down. And therefore, I have to conform to the demands of the herd, and I have to be terrified of disapproval of the herd. And one of the emotions created by disapproval of the herd is the emotion of shame and the emotion of rejection and the emotion of being outcast by the community, which is a kind of abandonment. Right? So loss, which is either individual or social, both lead to breaking of attachments, losing of people, which creates pain. So it's anxiety of pain. At the same time, at a deeper level, it also is anxiety of death. Now, this is not easy for most people to connect to inside of them. So the fear, the anxiety of loss, people can easily connect to the anxiety of pain. But
Or separation.
yeah, it's easy. But to connect it to the fear of death, most people will say that if I lose somebody, it will be painful. That I can understand. There will be anxiety of that pain. But I see no reason that I will think that I will die if that person leaves. Now, this is a much deeper unconscious dynamic, which is outside of awareness for most people. But at a deeper level, it operates.
Usually in therapy spaces, when we talk to client, we say death is not just the loss of someone in the physical context. It can be the death of a dream, death of a wish, death of a desire, which all translates into the pain of losing something in which is very similar to grief of losing a person.
Correct. So you can see it most blatantly in dependent personality disorder. That the dependent person is dependent on somebody, and if that person leaves, there is vacuum, and the vacuum is intolerable. And if you look at Why the vacuum is so terrifying to the dependent person? There are two reasons. One is the pain of not having anyone, and second is the anxiety of death. That if there is nobody to take care of me and protect me, I will die. I can't survive on my own. Now, this deeper dynamic of survival anxiety, death anxiety, is something where many dependent personalities find it difficult to discover within themselves. And that is why loneliness also is so terrifying to people. Because loneliness brings in sadness of not having anyone to attach to. It brings about sadness of all the lost attachments, the memories of it. And it also brings in anxiety of death, which is something difficult to fathom. That loneliness also creates the anxiety of death at a very deep level. That if I am alone, maybe I will not be able to survive.
Is it an infantile regression to be at mercy of the good breast?
Yeah, because the moment we don't have adequate attachments in the outer world, and loneliness is an extreme situation where we don't have any attachment, at least not activated inside of us at the moment of loneliness, the regression is very severe. And the regression activates the anxiety of death. So people will accept the anxiety of pain. Few people will accept the anxiety of death because it's an unconscious process involving regression to the infantile state. That the man may be an adult of 35, 40, but the regression takes him to a infantile state in the unconscious. So that is how the anxiety of loss and attack are related to the anxiety of death and pain at a generic level.
So, sir, if we see in the therapy space itself that different people respond to these basic fundamental fears and anxiety in a different way, different intensities and magnitude. So, if we try to categorize them, what would be the explanation for that? How does this fundamental fear and anxiety of death, pain, attack, separation, rejection manifest into different personality disorders? Is there a spectrum there as well where particular category of people would be prone to this kind of anxiety and how it translates there? How would you explain that?
Yeah. Good question. Personality disorders is a space where the fear of loss and the fear of attack most conspicuously, blatantly, almost inevitably play out. So this is a space where you can easily find out the fear of loss and fear of attack at play. And you can see that in relationships also where people are stuck, that they continue to be in the tragic holding space and they are not able to live essentially out of the fear of loss and fear of attack. Right? That the one-time emotions which are going to surge, in order to avoid that one-time surge of emotions, one continues to suffer for years to come. So personality disorders, you can see this very, very blatantly. Now, let me give a few examples to make it slightly more easy. Let me give 5 examples of attack and 5 examples of loss.
All right.
Okay. So that will make it easier to apply, to recognize it and apply it in therapy. Okay.
Right.
Let's start with loss. Right. So first example, some parent of ours, right, is staying out of the city, some other city, right? And if the parent is aged and we get the news that the person is sick and admitted in the hospital, suddenly the fear of anxiety of loss activates in us and we are full of anxiety. Not that it's going to happen, but even the anticipation of it creates very high anxiety, right? And we get peaceful only after news comes that he is okay, he has been discharged, right? So this is one anxiety of anticipated loss. Second can be, let us say you are living in a society and you have friends, and it's a transferable job of the parents, and somebody very close to you, his father is transferred and he has to leave that society. Another example of loss, that you are invested in somebody who has to leave for no fault of yours, but there is loss. Third instance, you are invested in stock market and you come to realize that you are going to make a loss, and along with that loss, many other losses are going to happen.
Right.
There is a real tangible loss.
Tangible loss.
Fourth example, you are living in a city for a long time and you get a good job and you have to leave the city, and your attachments are thrown all around the city, your memories are thrown all around the city, and it's difficult to break from those memories, and there is a very deep sense of loss in shifting of a city. Fifth can be, you are going to some place every evening, right? And you feel at home and at peace, and suddenly somebody else takes over the property for new development, and you are no longer able to go to that place, stand there and be with those people, and your evenings are no longer the same. And again, there is a feeling of loss. So loss need not be death of a person near to you, or divorce or separation. Death can be, loss can happen in a variety of ways. So I have given 5 examples of loss. Now let me give 5 examples of attack. Attack can be active or passive. Right? Active attack can be actual physical abuse and beating up. Second attack can be verbal.
Right.
Where in one-to-one situation you are humiliated, you are attacked. Third can be, there can be a passive attack of ignoring you. No words are used. It's a passive attack. So attack can be physical, attack can be verbal, attack can be non-verbal. There can be an attack of dismissal, that you succeed somewhere and you bring back a trophy and nobody at home is ready to acknowledge what you have done. They just dismiss it. It's an attack of dismissal. There can be an attack of non-acceptance, that we don't accept you as you are. You have to conform to what we say. You are not good enough as you are. So this is an attack of non-acceptance. So we see in our clients, these things are quite common.
Very common.
Right? So attack and loss are very, very common. And we see how much anxiety they generate and to what length people go to avoid this anxiety. Right? So once we know that attack can come in a variety of forms, I have given 5 examples. Loss can happen in a variety of forms, I have given 5 examples. This helps us to really figure out how this is operating in the therapy room. That when a person speaks of events in his life, many times, and I would say a majority of the times, loss and attack are involved in some form or the other. It is so pervasive in the mind space, in the pathological space, in the way human beings cope up. that loss and attack are at the root of hundreds of things. And the anxiety of loss and attack can be reduced further to more generic anxieties, death and pain. So at the root, then we will be dealing only with the two anxieties, the anxiety of death and the anxiety of pain.
In the discussion, you had mentioned that in the 7 typologies, the concept of spiritually dealing with this loss of pain of death or the loss. So if it leads us to this spiritual question of attachment and detachment, is it something there, somewhere there?
Yeah, this is a point where psychoanalysis and spirituality meet. Because spirituality deals fundamentally in a very central way with the ideas of death and attachment. Especially the Eastern spirituality and more specifically the Hindu spirituality, right? Desire is at the root of everything, and desire leads to attachment and aversion, right? And this attachment and aversion, right? Sorry, desire leads to pleasure and pain, and this pleasure and pain leads to attachment and aversion. And this attachment and aversion and the pleasure and pain, they lead ultimately to satisfaction of all sorts, or if it's not satisfaction situation, non-satisfying situation, then it leads to anger, sadness, and anxiety. And then the whole thing constellation builds up. So the question is, once we realize ki death, the anxiety of death and anxiety of the pain are at the root of things, what do you do about it? Now, here, there is a fundamental difference between the East and the West. Spirituality is more optimistic about what can be done. The limits of human potential are liberal. In psychoanalysis, the aspect is more pessimistic. The approach is more pessimistic. The limits of human potential are more conservative. So in psychoanalysis, the final position will be that we can minimize both these anxieties, but never erase them from the roots. So the goal of therapy is to minimize them and have the capacity to live with what is left. But in the spiritual traditions, it is said it is possible to really be free from these two anxieties, the anxiety of death and the anxiety of pain. So the take is different from the spiritual aspect and the psychoanalytic aspect. But what is clear is this is a point of confluence of the two.
So basically, in the spiritual concept, we are intellectualizing this anxiety of pain and death, whereas in the psychoanalytic spectrum, we are going to address to it as bringing it to an optimum zone by
yes,
acceptance and living out
there is
few of the
something.
desires.
Yeah, there's something more to be said. We are nearing the end of this session. We will continue in part 2 and come back to where we are. It's a very interesting point that you have started with. And there's something to be said on this point. It's a very interesting point. We'll continue with this.